Welcome to lesson 1-4. Today we're going to talk about solving absolute value equations. Go ahead and pause the video to get these vocab terms written down, then go ahead and hit play and keep going. So our first term is absolute value, and that's the distance from a number to 0 on the number line. Absolute value is always positive. We have empty set, and that's the solution set of an equation that has no solution or is never true. And we can symbolize that by using empty brackets or a circle with a line through it. Those both mean the empty set. Constraint. A constraint is a condition that a solution must satisfy. And then an extraneous solution, that is a solution that is found by using the correct procedures, but then it does not work when you plug it back into the original equation and therefore is not a true solution, but we would call it an extraneous one. So absolute value. For any real number a, if a is positive or 0, the absolute value of a is a. So absolute value does nothing if a is a positive number or 0. If a is negative, the absolute value of a is the opposite of a. Okay, so if it's negative, it makes it positive. So another way to write that for any real number a, absolute value of a if a is greater than or equal to 0, and the absolute value of a is negative a if a is less than or equal to 0. So an example, absolute value of negative 4 is 4, and the absolute value of 4 is also 4. So we're going to evaluate an expression that has absolute value in it. Okay, so we're going to evaluate 8.4 minus the absolute value of 2n plus 5. And then we're going to have n is negative 7.5. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put negative 7.5 in for n. 2 times the negative 7.5 is a negative 15. Negative 15 plus 5 is a negative 10. Absolute value of 10 is 10. Or an absolute value of negative 10 is 10. 8.4 minus 10 gives me a negative 1.6. So negative 1.6 is our answer. Go ahead and pause the video, plug a negative 2 in for x and solve, and then hit play and see how you did. Okay, so the first thing you should have done is put negative 2 in for x, so the absolute value of 4 times negative 2 plus 3, and then minus 3.5. 4 times a negative 2 is negative 8. Negative 8 plus 3 is negative 5. Absolute value of negative 5 is 5. 5 minus 3.5 is 1.5. Okay, so now we're going to write and solve an absolute value equation. Okay, so a standard adult tennis racket has a 100 square inch head plus or minus 20 square inches. So the difference between the given head of the tennis racket and a standard one is going to be 20 inches. Okay, and the standard one is 100. So the difference between whatever it is and 100 should be 20 at the most. So we're going to write and solve an absolute value equation to determine the smallest and largest possible sizes for a tennis racket. So again, we've got our whatever size racket that we have, the distance between that and 100, which is standard, is going to be 20. And so we would write it like this. So the absolute value of x minus 100 equals 20. So then to solve this, okay, so inside of here, we know that absolute value makes numbers positive. So what's inside of there could either equal 20, because if I take the absolute value of 20, I would get 20, or what's inside of there could be equal to negative 20, because again, absolute value of negative 20 is still 20. And so now I would solve both by adding 100 to both sides, add 100, add 100, and I would get that x is 120, or x is 80. Okay? 80 would be the least because it's the smaller of the two. 120 would be the greatest because it's the bigger of the two. Go ahead and pause the video and get these two worked through, and then go ahead and hit play and see how you did. Alright, so for this first one, I used the symmetric property and wrote it with the absolute value on the left because the variable is inside and we like the variable on the left. So I rewrote it as the absolute value of x plus 12 is equal to 9. So again, you're going to have two different equations here. You're going to have what's inside the absolute value equal to positive 9 and what's inside equal to negative 9, because again, absolute value of 9 is 9, absolute value of negative 9 is 9. So for each equation, subtract 12 from both sides, and my two answers are going to be negative 3 and negative 21. Same thing with the second one. I flipped the equation, so I have the absolute value of y plus 5 on the left, 8 on the right. And again, I'm going to take what's inside the absolute value and set it equal to positive 8 and negative 8. Subtract 5 from both sides, and I get my two answers of y equals 3 and y equals negative 13. Now, normally when we do an absolute value equation, we're going to get two different answers. Okay, but on special cases, it could be different. Okay, and the first one is there could be no solution. Okay, and there's also something else new about this type of equation. If you'll notice, the absolute value of 3x minus 2 plus 8 equals 1, the absolute value is not on a side by itself. Okay, so that has to be the first thing we do. Giving us the absolute value of 3x minus 2, subtract 8 from both sides, is equal to a negative 7. Okay. Hopefully you notice why this doesn't have an answer to it. And if you need a little hint, it's because of what absolute value does. Absolute value makes things positive. So if I take the absolute value of something in here, it is not possible to get a negative answer. Okay, I can't get a negative 7 by taking the absolute value of anything. So if we get the absolute value by itself on one side and the other side is negative number, there would be no solution, because it can't get a negative out of an absolute value. Okay, we got another example here. We got negative 2 times the absolute value of 3a is equal to 6. Again, the first thing is we need to get rid of anything that's not inside of the absolute value. So I need to divide both sides by negative 2, giving me the absolute value of 3a is equal to a negative 3. Again, absolute values by itself equal to a negative number. That can't happen. No solution. It also could happen that we only get one answer, and that one it's going to look a little different. Okay, so absolute value of x plus 10 is equal to 4x minus 8. So we're going to do the same thing that we did before. Okay, so the absolute value is by itself. So I'm going to take what's inside the absolute value and set it equal to the positive of the right. And I'm going to take that and set it equal to the negative, just like if it was just a normal number. Okay? So the first thing on this second equation, I've got to distribute the negative, giving me negative 4x plus 8. Okay, so now I'm going to solve them one at a time. Okay, so first of all, on the left side here, I want to get my x's on the left, so I'm going to subtract 4x from both sides. I'm going to get rid of the 10 at the same time by subtracting 10. Okay, so I get negative 3x is equal to negative 18. Divide both sides by a negative 3, and I get that x equals 6. Okay, over here, I add 4x to both sides. I subtract 10, and I get 5x is equal to negative 2. Divide both sides by 5, and I get that x is a negative 2/5. Okay, so I've got two answers, but on the top it says there's only one solution. The reason for that is because if I were to plug both of these numbers back in, they might not both work. So if I plug 6 in, absolute value of 6 plus 10 equals 4x minus 8. 6 plus 10 is 16. Oh, I'm sorry. 4 times 6 minus 8. 4 times 6 is 24. Absolute value of 16 is 16. 24 minus 8 is 16. That one works. So this is a solution. Now I'm going to plug in negative 2/5. Absolute value of negative 2/5 plus 10 is equal to 4 times negative 2/5 minus 8. Negative 2/5 plus 10, you would have to rewrite 10 as in terms of fifths, so that would be 50 fifths. Negative 2 plus 50 is 48 fifths. 4 times a negative 2/5 gives me negative 8 fifths minus 8. And we get 48 fifths over here. And then negative 8/5 minus 8. 8 is 40/5. So negative 8 minus 40 would give me a negative 48/5. Okay, and you'll notice that those aren't the same. 48/5 is not the same as negative 48/5. So this answer right here does not work. Okay, so even though we went through it, we did all the right steps, it doesn't work when we plug it back in, so I can't include it. This would be what's called an extraneous solution, because it worked at the beginning, but now when we plug it back in, it doesn't. So x equals 6 is the only answer that we would use. Go ahead and pause the video and give this one a try, and then hit play and see how you did. Alright, so as you can see, I cleaned it up first. I got the absolute value on the side by itself, so absolute value of x plus 1 is equal to 2x minus 2. Solved each case by setting it equal to positive 2x minus 2 and then negative 2x minus 2. And I got 3 and 1/3 as my two answers. Have to plug them both in. If I plug in 3, when I work my way through, I get 5 equals 5. That works, so 3 is an answer. If I plug in 1/3, I get 2 and 1/3 is equal to a negative 3. That is not true, so 1/3 is not an answer. It is an extraneous solution and it doesn't count, so we will not write it as a part of our solution. Only write x equals 3.